I lived in several different places in the Bronx. I was born in the South Bronx, and then we moved into public housing for about 11 years in the North Bronx. And it was moving up. And then when my mother went back to work, we were making too much money to stay in public housing, so we went into the private market, not too far away. I've often said this because I'm very involved in starting a public housing museum, and public housing for us was another indication that the government really wanted us to make it. The schools were good, the libraries and the museums and the parks, and everything was free, and it was a life where we knew we were going to probably do better than our parents, financially at least, and that we had an awful lot to support us getting through. I think it was a combination of things that inspired me. It was partly the tradition in my family, out of the Jewish tradition. It's kind of mandated that you do service. And it had really nothing to do with the religion. It just had to do with the culture. My parents were volunteers. And my father especially was not crazy about his job, but he did love his volunteer work, and he did a lot of different kinds of things. I was a teacher for a while, and I began to feel that I was more interested in what was going on in my students' lives and what was preventing them from learning. I love books. I still read a lot. And I was teaching English. But I got really interested in social work and psychology. And so in my mid-30s, I went back to school for a social work degree, thinking I was going to become a therapist. I had a placement. This was in Maryland. We were in Maryland for a couple of years, and Washington, D.C. area. And I worked in a crisis line, and then they asked me to get trained as a rape victim advocate and counsel rape victims and help them through the process. So I did, and I got, in some ways, radicalized by that, the issues around violence against women. That it was also one of the first battered women shelters in the country. And we moved back to Chicago, and I worked on a study of how police responded to battered women, and then worked in a battered women's shelter until I got this job as the head of a foundation that was an individual donors program that she wanted to focus only on women's issues. And we started something called the Sophia Fund, and through that we started the Chicago Foundation for Women, and one of our major issues was violence against women. And even though it was a very little bit of money, there were practically no foundations, certainly in Chicago and nationally, that gave any money to try to alleviate these issues. The Chicago Foundation for Women now gives away about close to $1 million a year to lots of issues that are affecting women. Eventually, the small foundation I worked for, the Sophia Fund, merged with the Chicago Foundation for Women. And at that point, I became a consultant, and one of my clients was Richard H. Driehaus and the Richard Driehaus Foundation. I eventually became the full-time executive director. We fund in 4 specific areas: the arts. We fund also the built environment. That's really our major focus. The subtitle of that is how do we help low and moderate income communities use architecture and design to better the communities. And then we fund in the working poor, and then we have another area in investigative journalism. Oh my goodness, there are so many people who deserve this award, but I'm just delighted because I think it means to the Chicago Cultural Alliance that they felt I was useful, and that's really what I want to be, is useful. And to see how much it's grown and to see how successful it is, that's the great honor, really.